just in case you didn't know, I'm married to that guy, Alan Wirfs-Brock, right? And we have a crazy shirt competition, and I won. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, all right.
Mine's Australian.
Yeah, but I got that for your birthday. Anyway, all right. So now I want to talk about decision making and heuristics. And I want you to put yourself in a spot to think about something before we get talking about decision making. So I invite you to think about a decision related to your architecture that either frustrated you or delighted you. Like, wow, it was really cool or whatever. And in the context that you have a friend that you're trying to get to join your company, all right? And what will you tell that person, all right? Everybody got something in mind about their architecture? So what will you tell your friend? Maybe it's something like, well, the moment you realized you missed something is the headline. Well, everything, the last sprint we went in to deploy at a particular customer site, and then, man, what we had assumed was all wrong, okay? Oops, maybe that's your situation. You gotta be kind of honest with your friend. Or maybe it's like, oh, so far, so good. You know, our product managers and tech leads are really starting now, and at the table that we had during our lean coffee, we talked about how do you make architecture work visible and get to work on. Well, now we're starting to be more diligent about adding architecture items to a backlog. And in our case, at our table, a couple of people said, well, we have 2 different backlogs. One for the technical stuff that isn't really negotiable. We have a budget for that. So anyway, so think about where your architecture of your systems and products might be, and realize that they came about through a collective set of decisions that people, imperfect humans, made. All right? We'd all like to think that decisions are rational, well thought out, right? But really, there is, when I think about decision-making styles, there is this, think about 2 contrasting scenarios that you might have. One where you really need to be rational about it, weigh your options, do your trade-offs, and then the case where you have outages, perhaps, and that you need to make a decision where under high stakes, uncertainty with complexity that you don't really understand, insufficient information, too little time, okay? So, there's this balance. It isn't like we're trying to be rational all the time, but recognition-primed decision-making has its place too. So when I work with people that are making decisions, we're doing agile architecting now at large scale, sometimes people think, well, if we just made decisions more rational, if we were just more thoughtful, we wouldn't get screwed up so often. But I think that there really is this balance that we need to be thinking about. So if I'm thinking about API design, where I really need to have a public-facing API that I support for a long period of time, I might want to take a little more time understanding my options, talking to existing customers, developing some proof of concepts that we roll out before we roll out to thousands of engineers using it. On the other hand, if I can recognize cues about things that are going on, there's the everyday sort of decisions where there's time pressure, not crisis time, but just business opportunity, and we don't have time to weigh the options. So let's talk just very briefly about software decision models, because it's interesting for you as leaders and technical decision makers and influencers to be aware of this. The academics like to talk about analytical models of making decisions, where we systematically evaluate the options. We have some description, we have pros and cons, we have some risks and issues, we have weighting factors, assumptions, constraints. I'm hoping I'm making you tired now at this time of the day. And we score it, and then we just pick the best one, right? It turns out, and there's formal methods like this, in my the last 20 years of consulting, we have never done this. It's not used very often, okay? But that's kind of, well, in some places it is, or at least some people tell me that it is, but that's not what the real world is. Oftentimes, when we're deciding, and this is actually an interesting book, by the way, my secret weapon as a software architect has been that I have an undergraduate degree in both computer science and cognitive psychology. So that has been my secret weapon, the cognitive psychology. So Gerd and his team talk about how we decide. We don't have infinite amount of time. So we have limited time, so our rationality is always going to be bounded and constrained. So we have limited time, limited information, and our brain power isn't just smart enough to decide. So we have bounded rationality. We also have this contour of the information that is in our environment that is easily picked up by us in order to make decisions. So we make decisions based on ecological rationality, like what we can pick up from our environment. And finally, decision making is definitely a social construct. So the important aspects of our environment are created by people that we interact with. So it isn't just, let's dial in the numbers. So there is a school of research and investigation into decision making, and I don't know if you've heard of this term or not before, but it's called naturalistic decision making. There's some common misperceptions that people have that's less rigorous. It's for people who are making hasty or quick decisions. But actually, the folks that started looking into how people make decisions under real-world conditions, and I say architecture and software is certainly real-world conditions, talked about what are the conditions for that sort of decision-making. Oftentimes, there's time pressure. It's a high-stake decision. People who are making the decisions are experienced. They don't have the right information they need. Sometimes the goals of where we're headed are poorly defined. There may be no procedures in place, rigorous procedures for how we decide. I need to pick up on signals from my environment. Conditions are changing. I need to coordinate the work of teams. Does that sound like software? So naturalistic decision making applies to us too. It's not just people that are surgeons or in airlines or fighting fires. So one of the more popular decision making models is called recognition primed decision making. And it's really all about assessing a situation as quickly as you can, judging an option to be acceptable or superior. And the term satisficing is, rather than deliberating and spending a long time, if I can find a solution or a decision that will move me forward that's good enough, I'll just go with it. And it draws on recognizing patterns. And if I don't understand exactly what's going on, I might use my brain to simulate what's going on. And it combines both intuition and analysis. So one of the things about this recognition primed decision making is, given when you have to make a decision, if you're experienced about this, you're always ready to act. So how do you interact and make a decision? So Gary Klein is the guy who is popularized this. It's a three-part algorithm, all right? So given a known situation, and I have known actions that I can take, If it fits that situation, I just do it, all right? If it's an unknown situation, which we've been talking about all day, it seems, with a limited set of possible actions, I try to gather enough information so I can pick an option and go with it. If it's a known situation and an unknown action, I do what was called satisficing, where I try to run through options, not exclusively or exhaustively, but I come to an action where I can take action and then there's something that's going to be acceptable. So one of the things about naturalistic decision making is that it works well when people are experts. And there are differences between how experts and novices decide. And I just want to say this to you as leaders and trying to influence and grow other people to make decisions as good as you might do, is that experts rely more heavily on just, I recognize what's going on, I pick up on cues, whereas novices are much more comfortable analyzing and deliberating. I don't know, so I'm going to have to go check things off. Experts spend more time examining the situation and less time on contrasting options. So we just jump to conclusions based on what we see. Novices spend less time examining the situation and more time contrasting options. So it's like they don't know exactly necessarily what they should be looking for. And if you're experienced in the domain, usually the first option that you choose or generate is usually plausible, and it's certainly not random. I picked up on something because I've seen something like it before. Now, this is kind of a paradox in that experts are less confident in their decisions than novices, all right? Which is like, okay, if someone's, and that really is something that can happen. A novice may, I did all the analytical things, I'm really confident about it. They shouldn't be confident, so just be aware of that. So, thinking about differences in decision making, there's also differences and advantages in making decisions in groups. So, for example, if I am trying to get an engineering team to work together, get tech leads to make some of those decisions, rather than me as a CTO telling people what to do, group decision making has some advantages. If there's diversity, we're going to have diverse opinions. We're going to generate a higher quality number of alternatives than just individuals thinking on their own. There's going to be a collective understanding because we have had this debate about what the options are and of the course of action that we take, and there's greater commitment and ownership of the decision if you felt like your voice was heard in that group decision. On the other hand, I have seen this happen in real time. Group decision making takes more time. Not only that, but sometimes groupthink can take over, and so if we don't have any well-defined process for like exploring the alternatives, people will just either be in the herd mentality, and sometimes even dissenting viewpoints can be suppressed. Oh, we just want a decision, so we will not invite those people to the meeting. I don't know if you've ever had that happen. It can cause also the case that because we're in a group, we're having a discussion, if there's a difference of opinion, they can polarize, can become even more confrontational than you might expect unless it's moderated. And individuals, if it's a group decision, well, the group decided it, so I'm not taking responsibility. Okay, so there are downsides to group decision making. So, given that there are different decision-making models and ways of thinking about it, and most of the decisions we make are under time pressures or some of these naturalistic conditions, how do we take action to evolve architectures in conditions of uncertainty? I'm going to talk a little bit about heuristics and how those play into the way we think and interact with other folks. And so let's get on to heuristics, because this is the second part of the talk. Heuristic is a fun word to say. Say it 5 times in a row. You go, oh, it sounds really... Some other definitions for heuristics are rule of thumb, something that works most of the time in the context that I know, something that is a general strategy that doesn't work all the time, but it works well enough in situations that I've seen. So Billy Von Cohn, who wrote this book that has influenced the way I think about heuristics, says that a heuristic is anything that provides a plausible aid or direction to where we want to go if we're solving a problem, but there are no guarantees, right? So think about that for a minute. I'm going to use that definition for the rest of the talk. Anything that we can try to do to make forward progress, but there's no guarantees. So it turns out that he's a retired professor of nuclear physics. And so I'm happy that he shared a few of his heuristics in that we solve problems by successive approximations. I think his values align very much with incremental delivery and development with feedback. He says, given the time constraints you have, if you're forced to give a decision or take an action, if at the moment you need to make a decision, be prepared for an answer. So for example, if I were to ask you how many ping pong balls would fit into this room, and I give you 2 seconds, how would you come up with that answer? Anyone? More than 10, yeah. Okay. What would be your approach? It'd be quite different than if you had laser beams and you could precisely mention. So if I give you more time, you do an approximation. So another heuristic that he says, a general engineering heuristic, is always give yourself an opportunity to retreat. So it's better to make a decision that is reversible in some sense. So we've been talking a lot today about making smaller decisions and backing up. That's a really good thing. And then finally, he says, use feedback to stabilize your design. So you might think from this that heuristics are simple, just little catchphrases. But I really think that there's usually a lot more wisdom behind any simple phrase. If you think about it, patterns. Remember software patterns? Anybody remember software patterns? Yeah. People are still writing them, by the way. Are another form of heuristic, and they are particularly handy because they explain the context of where the person who wrote that pattern found that it usually worked. And they also add information that more experienced designers may want to know about. So don't discount patterns. And by the way, we're still writing patterns. I hope more people read them. So there's also, one of the things to think about is there are 3 different kinds of heuristics that you have. Heuristics that tackle a particular design problem. So for example, consider these 3 ancient patterns from Martin Fowler's classic book, Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. He has 3 different architectural styles, but behind them are the heuristics for why you would choose one style over another. So if I have a simple app and data, and I don't need to do any sort of translation, I'm just shoving data to a database, let's use a transaction script. If I want to use active records and kind of those sorts of frameworks where I'm operating on rows in a database, I use a table module pattern. If I have complex data and I'm willing to accept translating it into an object model that I can manipulate, I use the domain model pattern. Okay. That was nice, Martin That's old news, right? What about CQRS, right? What about microservice? What about event sourcing? What about today's technology? And I'm going to say, don't judge an older system that you see based on today's heuristics, because yesterday's heuristics fit together and were used to build that system. So things keep evolving. You know, don't judge an older system or its design or its designer based on today's heuristics. Recognize that heuristics are going to evolve, and if you're a leader in your organization, you want to make sure that they do evolve. Just do it carefully. So the second kind of heuristic that we have is heuristics to guide our use of other heuristics. And if I got to throw out this one of my favorite word here, they're meta-heuristics. All right. So for example, this is a patterns book that talks about how do I reverse engineer a legacy system. And each chapter is a set of patterns that are related to a problem that you're trying to attack. How do I understand a system when I first get in contact with it? So, you know, if I want to understand the system, I start out by talking to experts, or maybe I talk with developers, or I talk with end users. I may go around, if I want to verify what I hear, go to these other lower set of patterns that are all related to my first contact. I like this pattern. It says, maybe this is one that's dated. It says, skim the documentation. Probably today there might not be much documentation. How many of you document legacy systems just for fun? But the other one says, read all the code in an hour. So of course you can't read all the code in an hour, but if you have someone guide you through the important parts, you really do get a good sense of understanding about a system. So then the third kind of heuristics that we have, and be aware that those are just as important as these other heuristics that we know, are heuristics that determine our attitude and behavior, the attitude and behavior of you, the attitude and behavior of your teams, and people who make decisions. And this is a funny example, but the heuristics you choose are a matter of the context you're in, your values, the fit with what you know, your approaches, and the efficacy, and your personal preference. So for example, if you are trying to go shopping and two non-nerds go shopping, the first one who suggests something, you go, oh, hey, sure. If you have a nerd and a non-nerd, the nerd will point out that this one is a better value, and they'll say, oh, okay. You get two nerds talking together, and 2 hours later, they're debating what value really means. So the point is, there are heuristics that drive the way we work and make decisions, too. The Agile Manifesto had things in it that people resonate with. Software Craftsmanship Manifesto is another example of it. But I also have heuristics that guide how I want to interact with people as well. So maybe, just to give you an example, is you might be wrestling with what heuristics you should apply to answer the question, how big should a microservice be? Anybody dealing with microservices in a new way? Yeah. If you go and look at other people's advice on this, it's all over the map. You've heard the two-pizza team size, right? You've heard people say, well, if I have a bounded context, now you have to know what a bounded context is, or an aggregate, that's a good size around which to structure a microservice. So if you know about domain-driven design concepts, that might help you. And then you have people say, well, I just think they should be big and then split them out as you find performance. So you hear all these, what's the right size, for this? And the fact is, experts disagree, and they still get on with the world, and they still build and architect systems that work. Heuristics often conflict with each other. Do you ever have design discussion disagreements amongst your teams? Right? Okay, that's because there's competing heuristics that are in the front of people's minds. Competing heuristics give us options. It's not something that we should be afraid of. There's more than one way to architect a system, and each of this makes sense under certain circumstances. In fact, there could be multiple heuristics that will solve our problem. And if you have a, let's say, dysfunctional engineering team, they may argue forever rather than just get on with it. So as leaders, we have to help nudge things along. So, what does Billy say about heuristics? What do? Choose the heuristic to use from what you take to be the best options at the time you're required to choose. So what that means, if I'm a leader, is it's not always that I'm going to be the one. See, this is another heuristic I have for growing expertise in my organization. It's not always that I'm going to be the one making that decision. We're going to have a reasoned discussion about it. And I'm going to guide people to understand that let's pick something, let's do a small experiment, let's make forward progress. But before we commit to something that's really costly, let's do some things and learn and adjust. So I want to end with some techniques for actively cultivating heuristics in your own organization. You might start out by asking people what are their favorite things that they're doing. A quick option is writing things on sticky notes just like we did today. I've had, well, we like lazy microservices, which means that we don't connect to, there's a bunch of whole things that we can talk about what those might mean. We want to talk about how we build out a system, how do we have trusted events in event source architecture. There might be some modeling gotchas. So you might start out trying to make people more intentional in your organization. One of the things that I do if I have a conversation is I've repurposed index cards to have a little bit more detail on them. So if I can ask, if I want to say, here's the action I'm taking, how many events should you generate from a business process? And the answer I turn into a heuristic with examples. So for example, the heuristic is generate different events for a business process if different downstream processes react differently. That's just an example of how I turn the question and answer with examples. Now, if I think this is an important enough heuristic that I want to put it in our playbook, I may take the time to write a heuristic gist. And this gets sort of like a pattern, but if these are important architecturally to make sure that we kind of follow the same things, you might go so far as to write up heuristics like that. I don't think all heuristics are worthy of such thoughtful documentation, but if, as an architect or a leader, you're trying to share your heuristics and educate others, getting people to be more intentional about what they're doing and writing some of this down, even if it's not exactly right, is a good thing. I encourage you to think about ways to become more aware of your go-to heuristics, to recognize that you need to be more conscious about sharing why you are choosing them with people if you want to grow them as well, and that there are always viable alternatives and consequences of the choices that people are making. I mean, it's not just doing that's enough. We need to have reflective practice that helps us learn. Experience doesn't necessarily lead to learning. Deliberate reflection is essential. So writing and sharing your heuristics is a great way to make you think and to grow people the ability to think about what they're doing. So this is an example in the slide here of a company, Zebia, where I spoke in September, where they were actually had a set of cards that they had written up more deeper heuristics that they were using in their consulting practice. And so you scan that code and you get a page. It was very clever. And they're working on writing more heuristics. Becoming more intentional about how you decide and get to the go-to heuristics that you find that reflect the values and the practices of your organization is where it's all about. And cultivating a culture of sharing and growing expertise, I think these techniques will help you do that. So expect your heuristics to evolve. And with that, I'm going to say thank you.
Awesome.